let me go ahead and resume recording. So starting workshop 5, can I get a thumbs up if everyone is seeing my PowerPoint? Great, okay. So let's go on our agenda for today. We're gonna, as always, we're gonna start out with our intercultural learning activity. The 5th one is hot buttons. So if you have those worksheets, go ahead and grab them or have them up on a screen where you can access those. We're going to talk about types and approaches to assessments and a different criteria for selecting assessment tools, and then looking at different samples of data sets that we can get from assessment tools and how we might use those, interpret those. Of course, there will be further discussion about data analysis later on in a later workshop. And then looking at assessing texts using a rubric as a form of assessment. So let's see. I think I need to set up do this. Okay. We're going to go into breakout rooms here in a minute to discuss the hot buttons activity. As before, when I send you all into breakout rooms, you're not going to be able to see the PowerPoint anymore. So these questions here, there's actually 3, but there's also these criteria included. You will be able to find those. I posted them up in the Meet submodule of Brightspace. For those of you who are new and don't have access to that, I would try to get you into a breakout room with people who do have access to that. So bear with me as we try to manage this. Do want to, try to get as many people into a mix there. Oh, and I see we do have some great. Okay. So we've got. Okay, so I'm going to open up the breakout rooms here in just a second, and you're going to discuss each of these questions, and maybe someone can take the lead on this. But I'd also like someone to consider about who from your group might want to join me in the fishbowl after. So if you want to volunteer for that or volunteer for your group, that would be helpful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open up the breakout rooms. But again, keep in mind, I may have to do some. Let me just go ahead and assign manually and see if that doesn't make this take less time. Okay. So I'm going to. Okay. And then. And bear with me, I'm getting there. And looks like, oh, wait, I have to go back one. Where is it? Let's see. Maybe, okay. Okay, so hopefully you should be seeing a breakout room popping up for you, and you can just hit accept and go into those. And everyone's in. Turn on the recording. So I'm turning the recording back on. So I would like a volunteer from each group. I can certainly select people. But if you've already established perhaps who in your group was going to be in the fishbowl, the others can go ahead and turn their video off. But if I don't start to see that, then I'll go ahead and start naming names. So, so I was thinking maybe Nandini from room 1, and maybe Janine from room 2. And let's see. Yunji is new to us, but I'd like to give him a chance from room 3. And then maybe Leslie from room 4. So if everyone else would turn off their video. And again, if you haven't done this already, if you go to the options selection under your video and you can click on video settings, and that will bring up a pop-up window. And there you will find turn off video settings. I understand, of course, Mikey and Logan will need to keep theirs on, and that's fine for interpreting purposes. So what we want to do, let me share my screen again before we get into this conversation. I just want to introduce a little bit before we get into the questions. Okay. So what we have here is, and can I get a thumbs up again if we're seeing the empathy self-awareness screen? Okay. So this is pulled directly from the AAC&U rubric. And this specifically is empathy and cultural self-awareness. Once again, especially for those of you who are new, we're actually reading this right to left instead of left to right. So the highest level of competency, the capstone level, level 4, is right next to the competency that it's describing. And that's so you can see all of the components of it that are involved in the highest level of proficiency. So for this activity, the hot buttons activity, what we're focusing on is empathy, which is really about the ability to access more than one worldview. Not only my own perspective, but the perspective of someone else. So accessing that worldview, but also demonstrating this ability to act in a supportive manner that recognizes that other cultural group's feelings. And then cultural self-awareness, being able to articulate insight into your own biases and rules, and then seeking out complexity, aware of how experiences have shaped these things, and how to recognize and respond to these biases. And so you're shifting, as it puts it at the beginning, a shift in self-description. So you begin to recognize that your self is more complex than just how you see yourself, but also your biases and rules and how others see you as well. So that is essentially what we're looking at in this hot buttons activity. So the intended learning outcomes for this activity are self-awareness, empathy, but also there's an additional one, which is emotional resilience. And that's acknowledging and managing our own emotions and reactions to stress. So by recognizing what are my triggers, what are the things that are my hot buttons, I can then begin to plan and strategize how I might deal with those when they come up. So it's about emotional resilience, managing those stressors. So this is the Tiagi debrief once again. So I want to go through each of these, and this is again a really great debriefing method to do with students once you've done an activity with them. So let's start with the first one. How did you feel going through this activity? How did you feel filling out the worksheet? How did you feel in your discussion? Tired, hungry, overwhelmed? Who'd like to jump in?
So I can start. I think hot buttons they're called hot buttons for a reason, right? So I think they automatically elicit responses. And so just reading through them, I could tell which ones were my hot button. Oh, why would that person do that? Or why this? And then the discussion that we had, because I talked about something that had happened this summer that I misconstrued in a different cultural relationship. And then it really made me think of how I may have been perceived by others because of my reaction, which I hadn't thought of that before. And so that's how I felt. It just made me feel kind of maybe reflective a little bit.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. Anybody else about how you felt during this activity?
I think I can go next. Our group, we talked about some of the hot buttons like interrupting during speech and also acting superior. I kind of had my own intercultural situations. I got some clarification, but everything kind of boiled down to the fact that we are all humans. And so something that, like almost everyone react to, like it was a common hot button for all of us in the same group. I think that was kind of comforting in a sense, like something that I perceive as a hot button is kind of spread across many cultures.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a lot of overlap, even from one cultural group to another. and keeping in mind, we all belong to multiple cultural groups, so we're bound to find some overlap with other people as well. Thank you, Nandini.
Yeah, I can. So basically, we discussed about one issue, which is about the punctuality. Because in states where we consider punctuality as a kind of one of the key virtue everybody should have. Everybody should be on time. However, we discuss about here, when people are late, we're sort of like not happy about it. But as we know, there's many other cultures, punctuality can be very, very different. For example, we talk about people working in Spain, people working in Africa. That over there, people have the time, concept of time is very, very different from what we have here. So how to really respect their culture and understanding they're not ignoring you, understanding they're not just do this for you, they just they do this without you. So knowing that you're there, you're the guest, how to adapt yourself to their setting is something we need to be aware and adapt ourselves to. Yeah, that's typical what we discussed.
Great, thank you, Yunji.
Yep.
Janine.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So I think as a group felt there were a few that were kind of problematic. Time was definitely one. When people speak too loudly was another one. And just basically, as far as how we felt in general, that you feel kind of disrespected. Say, for instance, if you're in another country and you're trying to get somewhere and get to a meeting on time, and then the person in one situation, one of the gentlemen shared that he was outside for like almost an hour, and the professor kind of let him know he was there, but continued on with his day. And he was just like, wow, so it's interesting. But again, kind of wrapping up what many of you said, that sometimes literally you have to understand the culture you're in and be compassionate and be willing to make those adjustments. So if we're in America, we say 9 o'clock and it really means 10 o'clock in Taiwan, then we should be okay with that when we're on that clock.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Janine. So I think what I'm hearing is that in general, doing an activity like this brings up a lot of experiences that we've had where we've had some of these hot buttons pushed by other people and, being offended, having the, being stressed by the situation as well. It might be interesting to note that an activity like this is often used by program leaders when they're partnering up students to share a room while they're traveling abroad, as a way to facilitate some conversation about if you're going to be sharing a room with this other person or these 2 or 3 other people, it's good to talk about the things that push your buttons ahead of time before those things come up, right? But certainly putting it within the context of, oh, I'm going abroad, what are their behaviors that might be different from mine that might push my buttons? So I'm going to skip to number 3. What did you learn from this activity? I'm going to stop my share so we can actually see each other a little bit better here. And I'm going to pick on Nandini again. What did you learn?
I think I learned that what I feel as a hot button is something that's shared across different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So as I mentioned previously, it kind of gave me the comfort that I'm not overreacting to the situation. But then the kind of examples that the other group members mentioned, like, like how people are being taught, raised not to interrupt. And when someone does it, then it's considered a hot button. I think it has to do a lot more than just thinking, okay, the American culture is so and so. I think it requires a lot more discussions with people in this culture rather than just assuming that, oh, this is what the culture is here.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I just met a certain set of people and came up with the conclusion that this is what the culture is. I need to really talk to more people and see how, like it's not just this one group, but culture is something that's spread across and it's a constant learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my takeaway.
Thank you, Nandini. Thank you. Leslie?
There we go. Sorry. So yeah, I learned that America seems to be one of the only, or I should say the States seems to be one of the only places that time is like more important than other things. Because in my small group, we discussed the timeliness and everyone had very similar experiences, or Winston was from the Caribbean, so he was very used to those sorts of things. And then we get into the fishbowl, and once again, that seems to be like a common topic that's shared. And so maybe my takeaway from this is why is time so important, and why do we just think that everything needs to be done like this? And maybe are we missing out? Like, are we missing things that are happening around us because we're so concerned to get to a certain point at a certain time? So
That's a really great point, Leslie. I might also, another interesting note is when we look at value differences, we did an activity with core cultural values where we were placing ourselves on a spectrum. From that activity, you might remember that time is often placed in opposition to relationship. So valuing time or valuing relationship, and to what degree do we value each of those things? So are we more concerned with starting on time, or are we more concerned with fostering relationships, and time takes a backseat to that? So that varies from culture to culture. Punctuality can mean very, very different things in different parts of the world. So yeah, we are definitely in the United States much more time oriented or time focused, and punctuality means a very specific thing, got a lot of flexibility. But I would note, and I'm sure many of you all have experienced this, if you had asked us what being on time means 3, 4, 5 years ago versus what on time means now today, post-pandemic, especially in a virtual space, we started this meeting with, hey, it's 1 o'clock, but I'm going to wait a few more minutes to allow people to log in. That's become a norm, and that's impacted our culture. So time also plays a role in how we interpret certain values, like punctuality, for example. So thinking about this in your context, and this could be from your own personal perspective, traveling abroad when you're taking students, your own personal experiences with these hot button issues, but you also might consider this from the program leader or instructor point of view, thinking about your students' experiences with one another and with the host culture. So the next question is, how does this activity relate to the real world? How might this activity be used, and what might be its use or its benefits using it with your students, or maybe thinking about your own experience when you go abroad? Janine?
Yeah, I'll share with the study abroad to Peru. I found the culture to be, I would say, timely when it's necessary, but also they have a lot of flexibility when it's more kind of relaxed environments. So when we're out on excursions, visiting farms and things of that nature, I think that there were times when we would look at the schedule and students were like, oh, we have to move to the next thing, but we may be in the middle of talking to a farmer about a really important process where there are more questions, or even having a meal, and how literally the planner has built these flexibilities of time into our schedule. We're unaware. So we have a numerical schedule, but he's already built in that time flexibility because he was aware of the culture. So I thought that was pretty fascinating, and it definitely applies, but it kind of caught some of the students off guard because we're like, we've got to be at that next, so interesting.
Yeah. Thank you for that specific example, Janine. That's really great. Thanks. Yunji, what do you think about this?
Yeah, no, I think this is a very critical issue. I not only about timing. I think I always, when I travel to different culture, I always think that, do people behave this way without me, or, because many times you just realize people just behave this as without you. That's just norm. So I think in many cases, I just think, we need to adapt to their culture instead of ask them to adapt to ours. So really, I think expose students to these kind of things really open their eyes, because, to be honest, like, America is a pretty unique country, right? If you compare on many scales, we're at a very extreme, right? In terms like independent thinking, in terms of a lot of issues, we're way up there. So exposed to other countries like Peru, they're the norm actually in terms of like the whole international society. So where really need to open our eyes, especially for students, to see, how the majority of the people, they're not like us. They're very, very have their own, culture, have their own reason. So that's one thing that's to me is the why we need to bring students to different cultures and expose them to.
Yeah, that's really a great example of understanding our relationship to the other cultures as well. Thank you for sharing that, Yuji. I want to jump back real briefly to those questions. Under number one here, thinking about a specific hot button, I put in these kind of rationale. What are the triggers? What are those buttons? Rudeness, indirectness or directness, inefficiency, lack of timeliness. So each of these things might trigger a response in us, a reaction in us that, oh, that's rude. But as we begin to explore intercultural differences, hopefully what we're going to realize is that rudeness is a culturally bound thing, right? So we already talked about this with directness and indirectness. Everyone is capable of accessing more direct speech or more indirect speech dependent upon the context. And we have a preference for one form of communication over the other because of the culture that we come from. If we're a high context culture or a low context culture. So certainly if we're low context, we need to be more direct because we feel a need to fill in those gaps of knowledge and information. Whereas in a high context culture, a lot of things are already understood, so less information is necessary. That is culturally bound. So our reception of that, of what is expected, and that's really what we get at when we think about rudeness, is when someone doesn't meet our expectations. They're acting or performing or behaving in a way that doesn't meet what we expect, right? And that's how we determine something to be rude or not. And I caution people, especially students who are traveling, to take note of, is this behavior actually rude? Meaning, is it rude within the context of their culture? Because we have people within our own culture, within our own circles, who may be in a bad mood one day and they act rudely. And that's because they're not meeting our expectations despite knowing the rules, right? Despite that specific context. But when we're traveling abroad, for example, maybe we just don't understand what the expectations should be, right? But also thinking about it within the context of our student groups. We have students who are raised in different households with different values and different practices. And if we have them sharing a room while traveling abroad, they're in close quarters, and those idiosyncrasies of the way that they live their life may push some buttons. Another one that came up is if someone interrupts you while you're speaking. Well, there are different communication styles where that's actually preferred. We call this, there's different pacing that takes place. We actually have a pacing activity. I think a lot of people in American culture are used to what we call turn taking. That's where one person speaks, they stop, the next person speaks. But in some cultures, it's quite common to have one person speaking, and before they finish, the other person jumps in to complete that thought, to agree with them, to reinforce the same argument, and continue on in a back and forth sharing of the conversation time. So there's listening and speaking going on at the same time. But there's also the opposite extreme, which is pausing, where one person speaks. There's a long, deliberate considering pause and reflection before a response is given. So it's just, what are we used to? What is our practice? And if something doesn't meet that expectation, we respond as if that's a rude thing. The next question I want to pose is, what if? So would this exercise better increase individual empathy capacity or group harmony within the students? So what do you think, if you were to use this with your students, thinking about your specific program, leading them abroad, would you use an activity like this to focus on empathy building Or would it maybe be better for group harmony within your group of students that you're taking abroad? Nandini, what do you think?
Yeah, I think this exercise really helps building the vocabulary, talking about instead of just saying, oh, we don't work together that well. Kind of doing this individual exercise to understand what each person's hot buttons could be like. So that's more reflective. And then having a group discussion saying like, okay, so you think this is rude. Why do you think this is rude? And when the other person listens to it, they kind of understand it from the other person's worldview. So it really helps developing that empathy and group harmony.
Mhm.
And so I feel like this should definitely be an exercise to work with the students.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Nandini.
Mhm.
Leslie?
Yeah, so I agree. I don't think that this really lends itself to help one or the other. I think they both work together very well to where by having the conversations, you're going to build that group harmony, but then hearing what everyone else is saying is going to help the students understand better why they may be thinking or feeling those things. And then just adding those conversations will also get students thinking about the other, like, well, I never even had thought that that was a thing. And so maybe I shouldn't be so concerned about this, or I shouldn't be. And so I think it really is great for both ways, building empathy and that group harmony.
Yeah. And Leslie, I love the part where you say the students may just not know that that's a thing, right? I didn't realize that that was the thing to really watch out for. That's such a great, aha moment for students sometimes. So thank you for that particular piece. Janine, for yours, I want to add to this a reminder of when in the hot buttons activity, it wasn't just about what are the hot buttons that other people push that upset me, but what are the things that I do that might upset other people?
Yeah, so I'll gladly share one of those. I tend to be kind of fast paced as a person, and at times it can interfere with understanding or capturing the entire experience. So I'm learning to slow down, but as an instructor at times, I can fly through information, or I can fly through, well, we saw this, let's get to that. And then sometimes the people are like, let's just breathe in the experience. And I'm like, oh yeah, let's breathe in the experience. So that's one of my, kind of faux pas there.
Same, I'm right there with you. I totally agree. Yeah, and the point being that this really does tie to that empathy component, right? Of, oh, I do those things, right? And I need to be considerate of other people's feelings, right?
And I often have to ask myself when it's brought to my attention, what am I rushing for?
Yeah, good point. Good point. Yunji, how do you feel about this? Increasing empathy and group harmony.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I just add on to something that the thing is, when we travel to different culture, what I do is I will watch some YouTube channels, because there's many YouTubers will say 10 things you definitely do not want to do when you travel to Balkan countries. So these things really opened up a lot of things. Some place you never want to touch head, the children's head. You do not want. So these are a YouTube channel hosted by Americans. Then I learned a lot in that way. And also I think I want to do this to my student. Give them some travel books which I read. And they will have specifically say these are the things as Americans, you want to be careful because these are very different culture. These are things you do not want to do. I think that's very interesting. And also on my own side, many times we press buttons, and I really appreciate the local people. They actually tolerate me or tolerate travelers like us, because they know we didn't know their culture. For example, when I was teaching in Rwanda, and in my class, actually, I didn't really pay attention. I talk a lot of the thing about, because I do brain imaging, I talk a lot of the thing about traumatic brain injury. I talk about major depression, while not knowing they have a genocide. I know they have the genocide, but so my class just went silent for a couple of minutes, because everybody was really, so at that time I just realized I should have touched these topics with more careful. So these, I'm not saying these are hot buttons, but these are the things I should have like pay more attention to when I talking about these issues, given the country's history. So these things I think as instructor we need to pay more attention especially when we lead our student to their culture, and we need to make sure these things are both ways. So.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that example, because it actually naturally leads into the last question, which is what next? What should we consider? What would we maybe want to follow a hot buttons activity with? What's that next conversation? And I think you bring up a really great point that, sensitive topics might be a natural follow-up to a hot buttons activity, right? So hot buttons tend to be, we're thinking more about kind of a day-to-day interacting within a group of people, but then in a much bigger discussion, we may want to think about what are sensitive topics that we should be prepared or aware of before we go into this cultural context. Any other, just for this is for the group, if anybody wants to chime in, and I'll also extend that invitation to people outside the fishbowl. What other ideas do we have about what next? What could we follow this activity with? Or even as we're wrapping up an activity like this, what kind of things will we want our students to take away and think about next?
So I would just like to say here, because I probably am less traveled than most people in this group. And it really, when we did this exercise.
I'm so sorry. Hold on just a second. Mikey had turned his video on and I went to go ahead. And I think we kind of interrupted each other. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. And so I was going to say, I was saying, I think I'm less traveled than most of you in here. And when we did this activity, I really appreciated the question that said, how did people react to you, or something like that? Because I honestly hadn't reflected in that manner. I hadn't thought about how were my actions perceived, or how, because we're just always looking at how we're perceiving things and what we're doing. And so I think it's really important for students to reflect and think about how could their actions be perceived by others, and how, what changes may they want to make so that they're not perceived as something other than they are. And I don't know that all of you would really realize that, because like I said, you've probably done this a lot more than me.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that, Leslie, that was awesome. The reflective part I think is really important. I thought, what could we do beyond this? After we identify buttons that are hot, how do we diffuse the hotness? Like, how do you ask yourself, if this normally bothers me, what can I do personally to develop and take myself down, another road, instead of going the road I normally go? And that developmental work, I think, is really important as well.
Yes, absolutely. That managing of emotions, right? Absolutely. So Mikey, did you have something you wanted to?
Really, it's just a short point. I wanted to just say deaf people have their own path of controlling conversations, of course. It is a little bit different. Many people, deaf people especially, even from other countries, value that communication aspect and want to know how to manage their hot buttons as well, right? But it is a little bit different from your perspective, but I have really enjoyed listening to what your guys' experience is as hearing people, just because it is so different. But yeah, I just think the community building is very important for deaf people, for sure. Absolutely.
Thank you, Mikey, for bringing that part up. And this actually kind of addresses part of Janine's question, is how do we figure out how to diffuse our own hot buttons when we're triggered? Part of that conversation as a group, talking about what are our hot buttons, what is mine, and you share yours, and let's talk about them. And the conversation about, why do I react that way? Why is this a hot button for me? Why do I get upset? Having that conversation allows the other person, who might be that person for you who triggers that, who takes part in that action that upsets you, it gives them a glimpse into your perspective, they can build empathy to, oh, now I understand why playing the country music nonstop is really annoying to that person. So because I understand that better, maybe I won't do that as much. And maybe that will mitigate some of that hot button pushing. So it's again, realizing what we do and how that's perceived by others. And that's why I really like this activity with students. You can have these conversations and hammer out. And you might have some students that say, yeah, but I really need to, listening to that music loudly helps me, write my notes at the end of the day. Okay, well, let's think of some solutions. We can put in earphones and listen to that music loudly. That's not bothering other people. If it's communication styles where someone, maybe they were raised, maybe they're like me, I was raised in a Irish Catholic family where if you didn't speak over one another, you would never get a chance to talk. So if I'm that person, maybe I need to realize, okay, maybe I need to try not to do that. But if my other classmates realize that that's the reason I do, it's not because I'm being rude, it's because I want to participate. It's an eagerness, right? A willingness to participate. If they realize that, maybe it won't trigger them as much, and they might be a little bit more patient with me and just say, oh, hey, you're doing that thing again. Oh, sorry, let me pause, right? So just facilitating those conversations oftentimes can resolve a lot of problems before they happen. But again, thinking about this within the context of being in a host culture, traveling abroad, we might be able to extend that patience and understanding to the other people that we're engaging with and
I
be
think
more
that-
aware. Yeah, please.
If I can make a comment, I think what you're saying is important. And wherever we go, I think we have, as a leaders of any study abroad or internship abroad, I think we have to give the students like a 101 on where they are going in terms of what is the culture about. I mean, we talk about timing, we talk about noise. And then if they, I think in one of the readings, I read that I mean, in the US, are not the center of the world, because at times I think we feel like that. And I was mentioning that, for instance, I have seen students from another university complaining about timing or being late or being this, and then I just heard the locals say, well, that's the way we are. And in a way, if we are visiting their home, we have to have some adjustments, even if we like to be loud, if we like to be on time, things on time, but I mean, that's where we are, and we need to make some adjustments and hold them for a minute or for that short period of time. And as I always tell the students, is there are two news, bad and good. The bad is that you may not like what you see. The good is that it's temporary. but if they want to do something about it, so then that is another step forward. And I was in a pub in Bath in the UK. I was with a set of British because that's where I went, but then a group of Americans came in a table and they were so loud. And then even the professor of the University of Bath said, well, to the rest of the people, let's forgive them, they are Americans. But like I said, we just have to, especially for our students, the other people we don't have control, but for the students, we have to tell them where we are going to. And we have to adjust at least for a little time, and then eventually help them to understand that that we are not the center of the universe, and to adjust. If they don't want to, well, don't go back to that country because you really like their things. Don't. It's not that you will like everything you see out there, or for that matter, every food everybody has. No, you try, you didn't like it, you don't agree. Well, don't go back there. That's, I think, my point.
Yeah, thank you, Tara. I appreciate it. Thank you for sharing that. So one last thing I want to share before we move on from this activity. And at this point, I will welcome everybody back from the fishbowl. If you want to turn your video back on, you're welcome to do that now. Thumbs up again. Are we seeing the debriefing slide? Yes, okay, great. So again, this is a summary of the Tiagi debrief method. How do you feel? What happened? What did you learn? And you know, notice that I did skip over like what happened. And also I tried to kind of be flexible with where the conversation is going based on what you all are sharing with me. This is meant as a framework. You don't have to adhere to it, you know, each step. And even in the conversations, like, how do you feel if someone begins talking about what happened during their response? You'll notice I don't, you know, stop, let's only talk about feelings. Just being flexible, and it's just a way to help facilitate the conversation. This is a really useful tool. So I, again, just wanted to highlight it. And 5 and 6 can be really valuable because that helps us, you know, really get to what do we do with this once this activity is over, because a lot of times we do an activity and the students are like, well, what was that for? Why did we do this activity? Sure, I can talk about my hot buttons, but how does that relate to, you know, my specific program? Or, you know, was this as valuable that we needed to spend this much time on it? But really getting students to think about what if and what next really does draw those connections to all the other things that you're going to be doing moving forward as well. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions about the hot buttons activity before I move on?
I guess my only question is, how do you get students to look at a hot button issue as a with a growth mindset?
That's a great question, right? And there's a lot of kind of prep work that can go into that too. And even just being explicit with people is like, look, and offering the caveat of we all have our, you know, idiosyncrasies and things that might be annoying to other people. And, you know, and you can hopefully make connections for them. Like if you have a brother or sister, I'm sure at some point they have annoyed you and you've annoyed them. But if you're, you know, a single child, we can extend this to friends in the classroom. Have you ever traveled abroad? Have you experienced things like this? And it can be really challenging. How do you get them to the growth mindset? Because sometimes you get students who are just kind of in a mindset where I don't need to change. Well, you know, we kind of have to deal with those on a case-by-case basis, unfortunately. But I think for the most part, the students we get coming to us that want to go on study abroad, who want to participate in virtual exchange, they are a little bit more open to that kind of a mindset, hopefully. But that's part of our job, is to help them get there, help them develop and grow. So I don't have an easy answer for that, but there's certainly different strategies that can be applied, some pressures, but also I really find rapport and relationship building allows us some kind of leverage with those students to help them begin to develop some empathy of why they should grow, right? So, and hopefully we can get our American students to not be so loud in public places when we're traveling abroad. Any other thoughts or questions? Thank you for that, Andrea.
I just wanted to add, it was really only after I began to travel abroad that the thought even crossed my mind that maybe while we grew up believing that our country is the greatest country in the world, every other country believes that too. And just that having to bring that equilibrium is a mindset change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that, Janine. Yes, absolutely. We need to prepare them. And that's why I think this is why we hear this so often from students. They come back from traveling abroad and they often say it was a life-changing experience. You know, it's because they're really getting this new perspective on the world and their life. So yeah, that's what we're trying to leverage. That's what we're trying to build off of. Okay, I do want to get us into the conversation about assessment tools. That's what we're all here for today. So let's talk a little bit about this. So I have some basic questions here. Who feels like, you can do a show of hands, you know nothing about assessment tools? And when I started this, I was right there when I was told, hey, you're going to be leading the Intercultural Pedagogy Grant Workshop Series. And I started going over in my head the topics that are covered. I'm like, oh no, I have to really bone up on assessment tools because I was rusty. I've seen a couple of hands go up. So who's used assessment tools before? And I'm going to answer this for everybody. everybody has used an assessment tool in one shape or another at some point, whether it was as a student or as an instructor or program leader. Does anybody have any specific assessment tools, especially if you happen to have experience with intercultural competence assessment tools, but certainly tool types that you want to, that you'd be willing to share? What are some assessment tools that you all have used?
So is survey considered an assessment tool?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I guess we all use it in our classes at Purdue.
Mhm.
So I have also done pre and post assessment surveys in some of the workshops that I do. So
Great. Yeah, and that can be, I think I've seen some discussion going on already in the discussion boards in Brightspace about the use of pre-assessments, especially as formative. That's certainly something we want to consider. But I have also been seeing a lot of questions about how can I find an appropriate assessment tool? What is that tool that is going to measure what I need it to measure? How do I find that? So for that, I do want to share the Hubicle. Hopefully most of you have had a chance to get into the hub and look around specifically in the digital toolbox. That's the page that I'm on right now. But this, again, this is a library resource it's a library catalog of various resources, specifically for intercultural competence. There's also some additional diversity, equity, and inclusion tools in here as well. But you can search by tool type. So we can select for assessments. And then we can also select according to specific intercultural competence learning outcomes. There's also some additional categories like friendship, diversity, and inclusion, some other categories we can also look under as well under the advanced search. But if we, for example, just look for curiosity assessments, wait for, and of course it's going to tell me to log in again because I opened this before we started today. Bear with me just a second. Okay, let me try that one more time. I'm going to go looking for curiosity. And so this is presenting how many, so this is just one page here. So curiosity, we don't have a ton for, but there are a number of different assessment tools that we can look into that do measure curiosity. But we do need to investigate a little bit closer. Are these more direct assessments, or are they more holistic? Something that's giving us more of an overview. And we're going to look at some of these different criteria here in a minute. But I did want to point out the digital toolbox is a great place to start when you're trying to figure out what assessment tools do I want to use. So let me get back to this. What were some advantages and disadvantages of different assessment tools? So we're going to look at this as well. So each of these questions are hoping to get at different aspects of assessment tool selection. So let's look at different types. The three primary categories are assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning, right? So assessment of learning is probably the one that most of us are most familiar with from even our school days when we were students. Final exams, chapter tests, it's summative. It's the summation, the end. Did we learn the things we were supposed to learn? Can we answer those questions on the final test? But it's not just that. There are a number of different surveys, program evaluation assessments that can be used in a summative way. And we do often use them in conjunction with a pre and post to compare if growth or learning has taken place. But then there's assessment for learning, that formative. And again, I use it as an example, the pre-test as a way to facilitate conversation. I've already talked to a few of you about using the asks to assessment. This is the attitude, skills, and knowledge short scale assessment. And it's a great way to introduce the intercultural competence, intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric, because this specific assessment measures or has students, I should say, self-report how they measure themselves in relation to those 6 competencies. So they can self-assess, fill out the pre-survey, and then you can have a conversation about what are these different competencies that you were asked to respond to, what do they mean? And how do we understand them? And how do we develop competency in these different areas or proficiency in different competencies? So they can be formative. They can be used as a way to instruct our students as well. This assessment as learning, right? So formative, they can be used to help kind of target what are my goals. And then as learning, teaching specifically about different aspects of intercultural competence. And I'm also thinking of, for those of you who have already done the IDI, the individual debrief where we go over the scores, what your results are for the intercultural development inventory. That is also going to be exploring the theoretical framework. So that helps people learn about intercultural development. So that can be used in a pedagogical way. So there's different ways to use assessment. It's not always just, did you learn the facts and information that you needed for this content? That can certainly still be used, but it can be used in a comparative model pre and post. It can be used to facilitate further learning and conversation. So these are things to consider when you're creating your assessment plan. And that being said, we definitely want to have program evaluation. That's what all of you are going to be required to do at the end of all of this in order to submit a completion report about your program. You will want some kind of measure of your students' growth. There are different approaches to assessment. So as I mentioned, holistic versus component approaches. So certainly the asks too, where you have 14 questions and they're specifically targeting self-awareness, and certain questions are specifically targeting curiosity, and certain ones are specifically about openness. That's a component approach. And again, going back to the digital toolbox, looking up a specific assessment that specifically focuses on curiosity, that's a component approach. But then there are assessments that are more holistic, like the IDI, that take a more big picture approach to evaluating and assessing where a student is in their development of intercultural mindsets. There's direct and indirect measures. So something that is very specifically and directly asking students, and again, going back to the asks, that's directly measuring a specific competence. But we can also use this indirectly by having students respond to essay questions and then using the rubric to go through and find specific statements that are reflecting a particular level of proficiency in a given competence. Something else to consider along and having touched upon using essays, do we want quantitative data or do we want qualitative data? So those two methods and approaches can give us very different information, right? And again, just to simplify quantitative, we're usually dealing with numerical data. Did they grow X number of points from pre to post versus a qualitative, which is looking at student artifacts that are reflections and essays and various texts or long answer responses on tests, but also video blogs or a blog that they might do in what is the popular one? I'm forgetting the name of it right now. I'm sure it's not coming to me right now. But the last approach there is something to consider in the criteria of selecting a particular assessment includes whether or not it has high or low face validity. So again, using those two examples of the IDI, was it TikTok? No, not TikTok or photos. Reddit was the blog thing that I was thinking of, more of a dialoguing blog. But there's different types of blogs out there. Sorry, I was just trying to keep an eye on the chat as well. High and low face validity, keeping in mind the IDI and asks. Well, the IDI is very low face validity, meaning that as you're answering those questions, you're probably not really aware of what it's measuring. Whereas with the asks, those questions are very specific to a competency, and you can probably guess what it is that it's measuring. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to do either of those assessments, a test drive is part of this, so you'll get a chance to do one, the other, maybe both. And of course, we have other options as well. So what are those criteria? Or criterion? There's a lot of different things to consider. So in this table, and this is one of the handouts that were provided in Brightspace, We have different assessment tools that are listed across the top. And then what medium is used. So whether it's web-based, the asks, you can either have a printed out version, but we've also created a Qualtrics version. And how you deliver an assessment can matter as well. The length, so how many questions are involved, because that may also be a consideration, because when do you want to give that assessment? How much time do students have to fill it out? What is your turnaround time for getting those results? But is it a quantitative, something they can do really quickly, or is it qualitative, where you really want them to reflect and have a lengthy response? Again, high and low face validity may matter to you, because if it is high face validity, then you've got to deal with matters of performance interference, right? Of where you get students who are responding because they're choosing a particular response because they know, or they think they know, what the correct answer is, or how you want them to respond, and rather than giving an accurate response. So that's something you have to contend with assessments that are high face validity. Low face validity, that's less of a concern. Cost is also an important criterion. So does it have a cost associated with it? And if there is a cost, is it too expensive? Do I have access to funding from my unit, my department, my school? Also, certain assessments require a debrief. So the IDI is definitely one of those that requires a debrief and requires someone to have received training. So we'll notice here the IDI does, the CQ, which is a really great assessment as well. And then the BEVI also requires training to provide debriefs. So you have to have someone like me or someone from Silmar come in and debrief the students' results. Do you have space for that? Is that really an important part? Are you wanting that to be a part of their formative or that pedagogical component? It certainly can be part of that. And then what is it specifically measuring, right? Is it actually measuring the thing you need it to measure within the context of your program? So there's more information about these and exploring them in this worksheet that is included on Brightspace. But this is by no means an exhaustive list of things to consider when selecting an assessment tool. And of course, I'm focusing only primarily on intercultural competence assessment tools as well. Any questions so far or comments? Mikey? Yep.
So I was wondering if for learning outcomes, so for curious and openness, am I able to develop an assessment tool that can measure and evaluate both? It's not like openness is its own thing and then curiousness is its own thing, but is there one that's available to measure both at the same time?
So certainly there are assessment tools that measure openness and curiosity. And I would even recommend the Asks To survey. And while it measures all of the competencies, for your purposes, you can just focus on the responses for just those specific competencies and either ignore the other responses in your analysis and evaluation, or maybe even consider how the other competencies interplay with curiosity and openness. And maybe if you're seeing a trend of high scores in curiosity that is mirrored in high scores of openness or of communication, for example, they're really good at negotiating meaning and communicating, they might be much better at exploring curiosity. So you might find some parallels to there. So that's one approach, is using an existing assessment. But back to my point about, do you want quantitative versus qualitative data? If you're someone who prefers qualitative methods, you may want to design your own assessment questions around those specific competencies.
Yeah, I would want qualitative for sure.
Right. So in that regard, you might actually look at something like the asks to get ideas about how you formulate your specific essay prompts, for example, what you want them to talk about to get at those specific competencies. Andrea actually did this and she had emailed me some examples where she had taken the AAC&U rubric and Andrew, remind me, I think it was self-awareness and empathy, is that correct? And then she tailored it specifically to her topic, which was politics. So that's certainly possible as well. You're not restricted to these specific, structured and already created assessments. You can even take these assessments and adjust them for your own purposes. I would only ask that when reporting back that be noted. But certainly, yeah, there's no such thing as a perfect assessment. And if we understand that, we should also understand that developing them further, customizing them, perfectly acceptable.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or questions about this conversation? We're getting into a lot of really great questions. Yeah, Andrew.
So I obviously been struggling with this because of the nature of the course that I'm teaching and the kind of cultural aspect that we're going with political. So, and I'm sure there are other people in here that are feeling kind of the same way of not really sure how to use that assessment, criteria tool to really narrow it down. And one of the things that you had in the articles was talking about using it as part of the learning process. So there was not a structured final assessment as such, that it was part of the whole continuum.
Mm-hmm.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Yeah, so that's often used at different points, different kind of milestones along the way in the learning and in the whole process of the curriculum, where we are presenting students with some form of assessment, whether it be an essay or a survey, that we then have a conversation about and try to, as a group with our students, pick apart and analyze and try to better understand, if it is a mastery type assessment, what did we not understand that we got these questions wrong? Or maybe it was a miscommunication and some information. But if it's more of a developmental model, what did we learn from looking at our responses to these things, right? So, and this is kind of similar to what we did with the hot button activity. They fill it out first and then they have a conversation about it. And it's kind of can be done that way at different points along the way in the learning. And you can still have a summative assessment at the end of your program. So there's a lot of different approaches to this, but even just essays with written feedback given back to the students that like, oh, I really like this. Did you consider this? And giving that back as well. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. There's a lot of useful informal assessments that can be used paired with feedback and paired with discussion that can be applied for that purpose of using assessments as pedagogical tools, using them as formative tools. Great question. Okay, this last part I want to share. I'm going to hopefully this is functioning properly. Turn this back on and look at some different data that we can gather. So this is looking at a summary of qualitative data that was collected for a short-term program. So this was student reflections, student essays, demonstrating mastery of a particular competency. They focused on curiosity, self-awareness, and openness. And they found that for those students who got no training, much lower percentage of them displaying these competencies versus those who actually received training. We're seeing great gains in how they're presenting or the percentage of statements that are reflecting those competencies at a particular level. So level 3 or above was specific to this study. So even though we're using qualitative data, when we go to analyze it and summarize our findings, we might present it in a numerical way. It's just to give you an example of that. So this one was specifically with essays and using the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric to go through and code student essays and specific statements that reflected that level 3 of curiosity, level 3 of self-awareness. This is an example of part of a result of the bevy. So this is the beliefs, events, and values inventory. And they provide you with different categories of assessment and then specific subcategories within those. And this is a comparative measure of how students in a group respond. And the interesting thing about the bevy is all of the statements that students are responding to are all actual statements that were gathered over a long period of time doing interviews with people. So these are actual real statements around negative life events and whether or not someone has had to deal with those experiences and to what extent have they been resolved. And that's where we get fulfillment of core needs. So what number of them are needing closure versus they feel that their needs are being met, and so on. So there's a lot of different areas that can be examined here. And so you have a lot of different data points and there's different results. I unfortunately can't tell you a whole lot about the bevy. This is not my one particular assessment that I'm very, very familiar with. I have had a little bit of training in it, but we certainly have my colleagues here in SOMAR much more versed in this than I am. This is actually from a study that I did. This is for semester and year-long study abroad, where we use the IDI. So we had a control group, and there are different kind of categories of growth. So this here in yellow, which is actually kind of hard to see, is what we consider stasis. So in our control group, we saw a whole lot of no growth backward or forward. And then a little bit, 25% of them did show at least one stage of growth within the intercultural development continuum. But looking at those students who received individual mentoring through the course, and then also compared to those students who received group mentoring. So multiple students in a cohort with one mentor. So that's another way that this type of assessment data can be looked at. And again, these are summative assessment, but this is a pre-post growth measurement. So this is just another way that this can be analyzed and reported back on. And then again, just to touch back with the various rubrics that we've introduced back in workshop 3, certainly the intercultural knowledge and competence value rubric is the one we use the most. We can use this to code students' essays, as I mentioned before. So this can also present a numerical score as well as a way to summarize and talk about these things as well. Any questions about these different approaches or the data sets that we're presented with? The last thing I want to mention is mixed methods, using both qualitative and quantitative, having a pairing of the two that allows you to talk about each results and how they relate to one another. That can also provide you with more robust data that gives you a deeper picture of student learning as well. Okay, I do want to be mindful of our time. I know we just have a couple minutes left. I did want to have some time for a wrap-up discussion. So I would like to hear from you all. What are your thoughts on finding appropriate assessments, how to appropriately use them, how and when you might administer assessments? I have some suggestions for that as well, but I'd love to hear your all's thoughts.
So I was looking at the kind of multi-step process of let's find out where they are. So get a baseline of some, using an assessment tool of some sort that kind of measures them. And then take them to the next step of modeling what we want them to do, those learning outcomes, so that they have an idea of what that should look like, sound like, the actions that go with it. And then have them sit in the perspective of what they think the other culture would be like, and take that assessment again as though they were someone from that other culture. And then the next step in the learning process, as I'm thinking through this, is to have them actually sit down with someone from the other culture and get what they would really have said in that assessment, and then have that discussion of what did you find that was completely expected or unexpected
Yeah,
in the conversations and in the results.
I think that's a great idea. I really like that approach. As you were talking, I was reminded of, let me share my screen here again. Using the rubric, if we want our students, if we start out with a pretest and we're looking at curiosity, for example, and we're finding that our students are showing minimal interest in learning more about other cultures, or they're only asking these simple surface questions. Well, let's look at the next level. We want them to ask deeper questions and seek out answers to these questions. So like you said, modeling that's what we want them to be able to do. So let's have a conversation about how do we form more complex questions? And once we form those questions, where do we go to find answers, right? And that's that next one of talking to a local, right? And actually, this is what I think the answer is, but let me check that with a local and find out if that lines up. So you can use a rubric like this to outline what are the things we want to model for them and maybe practice, and how do we get them to that next level. And so that can give you a kind of a guideline to do that. So that's one approach, but I love that idea. That's great, Andrew. Mikey?
So the IDI that we were talking about, I think I'm supposed to be doing it this Thursday, but I feel like it should be giving me a better idea of how to do these assessment tools, and which one to really look for, and how it's connected to my vision of my program. I think so. It should be this Thursday. I was just saying, looking forward to it.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I do have other questions, but I think I'll wait and ask them during that.
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons I came up with, let's do these assessment test drives. And not to say that this is my original idea. My contribution was, let's mix it up and not just limit it to one assessment, because I want to give everyone an opportunity to explore new assessment tools. So especially for those of you who are new, everyone's going to get a chance to either test drive the IDI or the asks to, or maybe we can even look at the bevy as a way to get you experience with those specific tools. What is it that they're measuring? And also through the process of going through a debrief, can this be something that can be formative or pedagogical for my students to help them learn more about their own development? So thinking about the IDI, right? Or with the asks, just opening up that conversation about what is intercultural competence? What are the different competencies that we need to know about? And maybe which ones do we want to specifically explore and develop further? So thanks for bringing that up, Mikey. That's a really great opportunity to dive into deeper questions about assessment tools that we might use. Any other thoughts? Again, I want to be mindful we're already past 2:30, but as always, I'm going to stick around for a few extra minutes. You can always reach me by email. One last thing I want to remind everyone, a couple things. Remember that following the workshop, go back to module 5 in Brightspace and respond to the reflection, post-workshop reflection questions, and also fill out your assessment planning worksheet there. And check out some of the additional resources that I've included in module 5 about assessments. The other thing I definitely want to remind everyone about, if you are able to get into the modules and do the discussion boards and the activities earlier, it gives me more of a chance to respond to some of you all and give you all some feedback about some of your questions. I was hard pressed to get through each of them before our workshop today, because we had a lot of late submissions. That's fine. I understand everybody's busy. I just want to remind everyone that the earlier you can get to them, the greater the chance that I can give you some feedback as well. Like I said, I'll stick around for a couple of extra minutes, but I see that some people need to go. So I want to give you all the chance to excuse you from this. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your week. For those who I won't see till next week. Hey, Yunji, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I just want to maybe, I don't know, it's a good time to set up a half an hour meeting with you. You know, if